All right. Well, I appreciate you for being on my podcast today.
It's my pleasure and honor. Thank you for having me.
You're the champion of the earth. So that's pretty great. Well, how about you give yourself your own introduction?
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I'll start with you. Ayakui, Neknau, Amy Cordalis, Nuak Rekwoi, Numite Wa Waklau. Those words probably sound familiar to you since you're Yurok. Just introduced myself in Yurok. I'm from the village of Rekwoi, right at the mouth of the river. My family's been there since the beginning of time, and I'm really honored to be able to continue our tribe and our families, or my family's legacy of advocating for the river and our culture and our homelands and asserting our sovereignty to the fullest extent possible. In my lifetime, I am a mother. I have 3 kiddos. I'm a fisherwoman. I grew up fishing on the Klamath, both for subsistence and commercial purposes. My family were a dance family, so we have ceremonial obligations down at the mouth of the river. I also am a lawyer, and I served our tribe, the Yurok tribe, as general counsel for a number of years. And then in 2020, things on the river were really, really bad, and the Yurok Council asked me to transition my role and focus exclusively on Klamath River restoration. So on dam removal, on water rights, on habitat restoration work. And to do that, I basically transitioned to creating a new nonprofit called the Ridges to Riffles Indigenous Conservation Group. And I serve as the executive director of that nonprofit and continue to represent the Yurok tribe in that capacity, and also try to elevate the voices of all Indigenous peoples on the river, acknowledging that we're all stronger together. So, yeah.
You come from a headman family, right? Down there in Redwood. So what's your family name? Bowers?
My maiden name is Bowers. The family name is Brooks Mats. So,
so you're related to Mel Brooks.
I'm related to Mel Brooks. Yeah, that is my grandma's cousin. So we have like a common, that would be great grandmother.
He was my last interview, actually.
Oh, was he? Oh,
he's awesome.
That was
he's so
good.
funny.
Yeah, he's a funny guy. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we're all related. I bet you and I are related.
We might be if we trace it back far enough.
Exactly. Yeah. I also have Karuk ancestry. My great grandmother Geneva Matz was originally from the village of Orleans, and she came down and was married there in Requa, and that's where she lived most of her life. But she also married a Talawa guy who was the grandson of Captain Tom, who was and I don't want this to sound too cheeseball, but he was one of the last, he was the last recognized Talawa chief. Yeah.
That's amazing. Orleans, yeah, that's my aunt Kristen was just had her wake there.
Oh,
unfortunately.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, she's Karuk as well.
Okay.
I got Karuk ancestry. That's where the Aubrey name comes from.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So for my grandfather Calvin, who he was the
Calvin
Aubrey.
Oh, Calvin Aubrey. Yeah.
He was part of AIM.
Oh, yeah.
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 They believe that. We believe that there was some government play kind of pushing him off the road, dying after some activism. That's what old school activism led to, before it was all legal battles and it was more foot on the ground protesting.
Yeah.
It was a lot more dangerous. You end up on watch lists.
Yes.
Foul play happens. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Which is why, I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, because you're basically taking us into the new era and the next stage of how to push this Indian movement forward, but do it the right way that is going to keep us safe.
Well, it's an evolution, right? And back in the day when our, fathers, mothers, grandmothers, aunties were fighting, there was the Salmon Wars, right, out at Yurok country. Indian country at large was a terrorist organization, basically. Like, we were the number one threat to, sort of society. And so a lot of our leaders, like probably your grandfather, my great uncle Raymond Matz, and many, many more, they were targeted by both the federal and state governments as threats, right? And all they were doing was, at least in the case of my family, like, they were just trying to be Indians. They were just trying to fish. They were just trying to be on their homelands and on their home waters. And, 60s, 70s, like, that was controversial. And so I've always felt lucky and privileged that in our generation, we can assert those rights. We can be Indians in a safer way, really, right? And as you pointed out, most of my work, it's legal work where I assert the tribe's rights, Yurok tribe's rights in court within federal agencies and Congress, with other NGOs and businesses. And, because of the strong sort of, advocacy and the battles, just the way that the previous generations really were warriors in their successes, I can do this work on their sort of shoulders and do it in a safe way.
Is that your grandmother in that famous photo down at the fish shop over in Crescent City?
I don't know.
Basically, federal agents are coming up to her.
Did you see this? The picture
That's
behind?
The photo
Yeah, there. So
about.
yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we should show. We could pull it off the wall if you want to take it off.
After the interview,
okay,
I'll
yeah,
show
cool.
it. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that is. So that's in the boat. My great grandmother Geneva Matz, and then my grandmother Lavina Bowers went down to the river during the fish wars to to protest, basically. Would you like me to tell you the whole story?
You got a quick synopsis.
Okay, yeah. There's so much there. Because
I do want to get to you, but I want to establish like a timeline about how where you come from.
Yeah, we thank you. I appreciate you starting in that place, because everything I do is based on that family role, and also our role as Yurok people to be stewards of our natural resources. In our creation story, it was basically established that, we get to be the beneficiaries of this amazing place, like the Klamath Basin, right? Where there's the largest redwoods in the world, right? Some of the biggest salmon runs, sturgeon runs, the elk herds, the deer, and even just think of the climate and how lovely it is over there. It's so, temperate. So we get to be the beneficiaries of this, but we also have an obligation to speak up for all those natural resources and to live in a balance with them so that they can continue to be here on Earth and maintain that balance between humans and nature. So everything I do is sort of in honor and recognition of that's who we are as Yurok people, and that's how my family has lived and been here. So to understand, the work that I do and why, and I think this is so true for many Yurok people, like to understand why we do what we do, you have to know that history. So the fish wars, and it really starts back with, one thing I think is really important for everyone to know is that Yurok people were never relocated. We stayed on our homelands through colonization. We lost some of our homelands, right? Our reservation was created in 1855, and it only includes a mile on either side of the Klamath River from the mouth of the river up 45 miles to the village of Witchpeck. Our Aboriginal territory was much larger than that. We had control of the coastal lines basically from about, I would say 10 miles, maybe more, just outside of Crescent City. They call it False Klamath Cove, but I don't know if folks know what that is. So, so a little ways down from Crescent City, all the way almost to McKinleyville and like the little river mount there. That was all our land. And then it stretched up through the Klamath River and then into the first coastal range into our high country. And, those are the mountains just behind the east side of the river, right? So we had this like beautiful, beautiful homeland. And we actually did try to negotiate a treaty. We did negotiate a treaty with the U.S. in 1851, but Congress failed to, specifically the Senate failed to ratify it because California opposed it. And so instead, our reservation was created in 1855 and was just a mile on either side of the river, up 45 miles. And then the General Allotment Act happened in 1888, and the reservation was open for homestead. And a lot of our people got allotments. You may have one or many in your family.
There's the Aubrey Ranch.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we lost a lot of...
And we got allotments in Pequon, too.
Yeah, see? Yep. But we lost a lot of that land on the reservation. And in 1933, the state of California passed an act that said no Yuroks could fish on the lower Klamath River. Like we couldn't gill net, we couldn't fish basically without any kind of state permit. So we could have 2 fish a day or something like that, which for Yuroks, that's like telling us we can't breathe anymore. Yeah,
we needed the fish to survive. We didn't have power. We didn't have, we need that river.
Exactly. Yeah. And so many Yuroks kept fishing. And then actually it was we kept fishing, and my great uncle kept fishing, Raymond Matz, and he got arrested by the state 19 times for just fishing. And finally on his last arrest, he said, you know what, I'm not paying the fine. The judge said, give me $1. He said, no, I'm not paying the fine. I have Indian rights, and I'm gonna, take my case all the way to the Supreme Court. That's what I have to do to prove that I have rights to fish here. And what's interesting about that is that was like 1969, and that's right when, of course, the civil rights movement was happening across the country. And one of the things that came out of the civil rights movement was legal aid funding from the federal government. And so the California Indian Legal Services was started at that time. And one of the first cases they took was my Uncle Ray's case. And that led to the Supreme Court case, Matz versus Arnett, which...
My family, the Reed side of the family, which is the Yurok side, we had a court case, but actually the Matz family court took precedent.
Okay, yeah. So, because that was a Supreme Court case, right? Yeah. And basically what that case held was that, despite the Allotment Act that opened the reservation was still Indian country because it still had its Indian character, which meant that there were still Indians like our families fishing it, using it, and because of all of that, it was still Indian country. So our reservation was still ours, and that meant we had inherent sovereignty, we had fishing rights, so we could fish free from any kind of state intrusion. You would have thought that was enough. Right? Like you would have thought that. But then the federal government, about a couple years after that decision came down in 1978, put a complete moratorium on all Yurok fishing on the river again, and saying it was for conservation purposes. And it wasn't, because offshore commercial fishing continued, like the fishing runs were fine. They were basically just trying, the pressure was that people thought the Yurok were basically taking all the fish, and so they didn't want that. So the federal government cut us off, complete moratorium, and to fight back, members of the Yurok community, including my great-grandmother and grandmother, went down to the river and protested. And the federal government sent in armed federal marshals to enforce the moratorium. And so, here my very petite, under 5 feet, tall, grandmother and grandma are in the boat, and these massive, fully armed federal marshals come up and try to take their net. And there's actually a big story that goes to that. What happened was my grandmother and this federal marshal engaged in like this tug of war over the net. And then my great grandmother got really kind of nervous and scared, and she stood up in the boat and started praying and started singing, and a bunch of birds came, and they're on the estuary, in the middle of the estuary, and a bunch of birds from all directions came, all kinds of birds. So, imagine seagulls and hawks and, little wrens and herons, and I imagine there's eagles there too. And they just started swarming above the boat and diving in and out. And the federal marshals got so scared, they just got the heck out of there. They just left, So that's how that crazy. Ended. Yeah. And then eventually by the end of 1979, the feds, the federal marshals left the reservation. And then that triggered discussions between...
That's where the Hoopa, the Yurok thing happened.
It led to all of that, and then also more regulation of the Yurok fishery, because I think it became clear to the federal government that the Yurok people were never going to stop fishing. And so, there was a need to form a Yurok government. We had always been a federally recognized tribe, but we didn't have a modern Yurok government. So, there was another federal act to do that. But that's important because that's sort of the legal foundation of what was to come, right? And those core legal rights, that the tribe has a reservation, we have inherent sovereignty on the reservation, we have federally reserved fishing rights, water rights, hunting rights, we can regulate our people there. That was the foundation for sort of the legal work and the leverage to remove Klamath dams.
Okay, so that was an amazing story. I'm not going to lie to you. I was not expecting birds to come out of the sky, your grandma praying to the creator, and that's magic, and that's beautiful, and that just shows, I wanted to start there because that at the core of it, of all this work, it comes down to us as a tribal sovereignty and Yurok citizens. Our fight has always been over this water, and just the person trying to take our rights has changed. I mean, the government has always been around in the process, but it was originally the commercial fisheries that were against it, and then you got currently the fight is mainly, from what I notice, the farmers or the want to take this water and fill their aquifers with it. They rely on that dam because it keeps all the water in one place. And also they don't have aquifers that are built sustainably. We got rid of the beaver, and their aquifers kind of just flood, drain away. And so they're always in constant need. And so they have that scarcity mindset that the river is just going to wash away into the ocean. They're never going to have water again. And so what was your experience fighting that Siskiyou water?
So water. We're still in it in that. And what I'll say is that I think the conversation has evolved. And with Klamath dam removal, we are now united, right? It used to be that the dams really did, from an ecological perspective and almost like a physical perspective, the dams divided us from upper and lower basin. It was like an iron gate. We had that Iron Gate Dam that sort of tried to, and in some ways just like separate us. And now that the dams are gone, we have a free-flowing river, right? It's free-flowing for over 450 river miles, right? It starts in the top of the basin in southern Oregon and then goes, and what's remarkable is even at the very top of the basin, like the headwaters of the Klamath really come from Crater Lake. But then there's also water that flows in from the Wood River, the Sprague, the Williamson River, and all goes into Upper Klamath Lake. And there are still two dams that don't block fish passage, but they're still there. That sort of, well, they were built on the edge of a natural reef between the Klamath Lake, Upper Klamath Lake, and then the river. So those are still there, but still, the water is flowing down into the Klamath main stem all the way to my home village. And I think, and also this year, as we know, salmon have gone all the way back into basically almost to Upper Klamath Lake. And so all of a sudden, yet again, we are united by like water and ecosystem and fish. And what I hope is that will bring everyone together in a way that helps us frame a conversation to figure out how do we make life sustainable in the Klamath Basin. Because, like we have Yurok ancestry, we have Karuk ancestry, but then there were Shasta people, there were Modoc people, there were all the different tribes that make up what is now the Klamath tribes. And I'm doing this because that's the direction that they are in. Yeah. But we know how to live sustainably based on the Klamath and its bountiful resources. And we did that as indigenous peoples for a millennium, right? And then, of course, colonization happened, and the balance, the sustainability, the primary principles of like, you never take more than what you need was all disrupted. And, the colonizers came in and developed the basin for profit, right? They drained one of the lower Klamath Lake. They completely redid the hydrology up in Upper Klamath Lake and the areas around it. They drained wetlands, over 200,000 acres of wetlands they drained turn into the Klamath Reclamation Project. And that fundamentally changed the ecosystem and the ecological functions of the upper basin, right? And so that, and then of course, they diverted a bunch of water to basically, provide water to the irrigators, the farmers that in some ways and often were given the Klamath tribe's land, right, to farm.
The homesteaders we mentioned. Yes, there's also the Dawes Act.
Yep,
we
all
won't
that.
go too far.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, the river was dammed. And so you have this period of like 100 years from like 1905 to, it wasn't even 100 years, like 1964 was when the last dam on the Klamath was built. So you have it, not even 70 years. But in that time, the Klamath was just pillaged. And then, of course, you add like even before that, the gold rush. And then down in our neck of the woods, there was, logging of the old growth forests. And it really annihilated the Klamath. And so that's kind of how we've been managing things is for just profit. And
people would also say power, but I do want to point out that it only created 160 megawatts of energy, which only powers about 70,000 homes.
Yeah.
And so the Pacific Corp, that was being fed straight into the power grid. So it wasn't even just going straight to these homes.
No.
And that power grid serviced 6 state areas.
Yeah.
So it didn't even power 2% of the entire Pacific Corp energy.
Exactly.
So in that work of everything we kind of just discussed, what points led you to be recognized on Times 100 climate list, which is a huge thing in the first place, and then you're recognized by the United Nations as the champion of the world. I'm trying to
champion of the earth.
It's the world to me.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, because if the world came together and said, "This is the champion," then, that's a big deal.
Thank you.
And I think Native women and Native men even can look up to you, and I'm sure they want to hear how they can follow in your footsteps.
You know what it was? I listened to my elders. I listened to my elders. I listened to our ceremonial leaders. I listened to our tribal leaders. I listened to my peers. And also, I learned a new language through the law to communicate the messages and the wisdom that is inherent in our communities. And I try to, translate that in a language that business leaders, that lawyers, that federal officials understood, and use their terminology, but used our way of thinking, right? And so I think our most powerful tool is our culture, is our inherent sovereignty, our ancestral knowledge. We are so powerful when we tap into who we are, when we remember who we are, right? Because we have been living on this earth since time immemorial in balance with the natural world, right? Like there's a reason the Klamath River was the third largest salmon producing river in the whole lower continental US. That was because the indigenous peoples of the river knew how to live in balance with it and take care of it. So we nurtured that, right? I mean, we've been fishing those same wild salmon runs since the beginning of time. And my dad always says that we have the same DNA as those wild fish.
Yeah.
So I've been so blessed to be able to work really closely with our tribal leaders. Your dad being one of them. I've been really blessed to, participate in our ceremonies and try to really tap into, the power that be around our culture, our river, our religion. And so if there's anything out there, it's like, if there's any lesson out there, it's listen to your elders and be open to the message. And one of my other tricks is, before I speak, I always like to ask the Creator for the right words, because when we speak on behalf of on behalf of our rivers or our cultural natural resources, our water, our land, that is bigger than ourselves. It's beyond our own egos. And so if you can be a vessel of, communicating the Creator's sort of vision and helping that to be, it's so powerful. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, I appreciate
Thanks.
that. So that actually leads into a topic that I'm really interested in.
Okay, cool.
And it's how is your organization using that traditional ecological knowledge, that traditional spiritual knowledge, and then integrating that with the River Restoration Project?
Yeah. So what you just described is the core value and approach to our work. So the Ridges to Riffles Indigenous Conservation Group, we go by R2R. It is, the mission is to provide technical and legal services to tribes and Indian people and organizations in the area of cultural and natural resource protection. And the model there is really based on using traditional knowledge. And one thing to think about is, I think when we call it traditional ecological knowledge, we limit the knowledge, right? For Yurok, our worldview is really based in living in a balance with the natural world, and that's how we go about and what we do. And it's not just ecological, even if it's based in ecological, balance and understanding. So I always just call it traditional knowledge, right? Which is that ancestral knowledge. It's that inherent knowledge. So we try to marry that with, modern science, and sort of figure out okay, under this traditional knowledge base, we have thousands and thousands of years of anecdotal knowledge about how, the salmon or let's just even get it smaller, how the Blue Creek fish, which are the Chinook, they come in to the river at the very end of the larger Chinook, run. And why is that, right? And our culture answers that. But we try to do things like that of marrying the traditional knowledge with the anecdotal information, and then kind of seeing where that plays into with the modern knowledge. And then I do that same thing with the law, right? At Yurok, we have Aboriginal law. there's ways that we regulated everything. One example is fishing holes. Those were owned by families, right? And so if you owned a fishing hole, you had the power to exclude, you had the power to allow access. If somebody went in and fished without your permission, they had to give you payment, right? And then payment was the way that we sort of resolved our
Mel
conflicts.
Brooks actually went into that a little bit.
See?
And then he talked about how Talo got their fishing rights.
Okay.
And it was basically that ended over someone getting getting killed. And then I guess that village came to the other village and they established payment, but the person his brother died didn't accept that and still murdered the guy even though payment was already made. So now that village owed the Talawas the fishing rights.
See, that's exactly how it would go. See, because that fishing right could be exchanged as a property right. It was something that had value. So with the law, like I try to empower that Aboriginal law, and then make sure that is in and the foundation of Yurok tribal ordinances. So Yurok can pass its own laws, and it has that. There's a ton of ordinances, and so we make sure those ordinances are consistent with our Aboriginal law. But then also, I try to make sure that anytime there's an agreement, the dam removal agreement is an example. Anytime there's a federal law that could apply to Yurok, anytime we're making legal arguments in court, I try my best to make sure that all of that is consistent with our Aboriginal law, because that's who we are as people, right? So at Ridges to Riffles, we're trying to have Indigenous-led conservation. But what that means is that it's informed by Indigenous values, law, policy, science, experience, worldview. And what's most important is that it is also led by Indigenous peoples, and that we're giving, and that means like at a staff level, but also who we're working with and our approach, right? Like, we listen to whoever is the tribal leadership and do our best to implement that vision, right? So it's all about organizing power and money in a different way, right? Because, and this is one of my dad's things, he always says, like, you can't keep sticking your hand in a mousetrap and expect to get a different outcome.
That's how the CEO from United ends up getting clipped in New York, unfortunately. Yeah.
My point is, I know. Well, exactly. And so that's why it's we can't keep relying on the federal government or, some big NGO or whatever it is to do our work. We have to do our work. But the key is pulling those resources, and that's hard, right? Because we're, even now, it's something like 0.1% of philanthropy dollars in the U.S. goes to serving Indian country. So we have to invent the wheel and overcome old power structures. But we did that through Klamath dam removal. So I know that we can do that in other areas. It's possible.
So what other areas do you think? Do you have a projection of where you want to go, or is
already Ridges to Riffles is working in a few different areas. We've got a strong relationship with a group called the Salmon People with Setting Suns Productions. I know you've been involved with them to some extent, right?
A little bit, yeah. I've done some shooting for them.
Yeah, and they're trying to unite all of the salmon Indian nations along the West Coast, and it's a really beautiful project of bringing Indian people, salmon people back together. Through colonization, we were separated, we were marginalized, and our meeting places were destroyed. Like, I think about Celilo Falls over on the Columbia River. That was one of the biggest historical meeting spots in all of North America in Aboriginal times. And I think it was in the 50s, they flooded it. Destroying our historical places. And so now through, the Salmon People Project, we're bringing everybody back together to have conversations and they're literally starting with like, I'm a salmon person too, you know? So it's starting with sort of the ground, but we're learning fast and we're identifying we have so much in common. That has led us also to starting discussions with people on the Snake River about the work of removing Snake River dams. That has also led us to, we just hired a woman, an Elwha tribal member who worked on the Elwha dam removal. And so she's working with us now to help us with our tribal engagement and really just helping to uplift the tribal voices on the Klamath, but then also sort of in these other arenas as we move into it. We're also working with reforming the Federal Power Act, which is one of the primary federal laws that can be used, is relied on to authorize new dams or pipelines or, reauthorize licenses to operate hydroelectric projects, dams and pipelines. And that law and the way it's been interpreted has obviously excluded and not considered Indian rights. You wouldn't have had dams on the Klamath River if our rights were considered when those dams were built. And so what we're trying to do through, and it's called an Uncommon Dialogue. It's a group of hydropower businesses, NGOs, states. We're trying to incorporate more Indian law principles and uplift the voices of tribal leaders through giving them opportunities to participate and also to helping again, it comes back to being able to listen to the tribal elders and leaders and translate their words into a language that, federal officials speak, right? And so we're doing that in that Uncommon Dialogue area, which will affect the country. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Well, we're trying. And, our vision is we'd like to be able to serve Indian country because there's such a need, but we want to also make sure that we're growing in a good way, so.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you foresee, so we talked a little bit at the beginning before we got started about the new bill that's being passed, about giving the executive power, the power to basically, if they see a nonprofit as a terrorist organization or they're supporting a terrorist organization, they can basically shut it down. So just seeing how the fight of the previous dam removal, and now it sounds like you're leading into a new dam removal fight. Although it is a legal battle, do you foresee that being an issue of him coming, or the executive office coming down and being like, that's a terrorist organization? Or maybe a power company comes and tosses a lot of money to the right official for them to say, well, they at least support terrorist organizations, and then shut you down. What do you think?
Couple thoughts. Indians organizing in this country has always been seen as a terrorist threat. In the 1970s, AIM was the number one terrorist threat to the country. And so they've always seen us as dangerous in that way. I hope that we are now at a place where people can start to see that changing your way of life, removing a dam isn't a threat to American safety, public safety, that instead it's an evolution, right? Old ways are destroying the environment. Old ways, it was like you said earlier, the Klamath dams were producing 1% of Pacificor, the owner's overall power portfolio. So they were really just these legacy dams that were killing tribal cultures in the environment. So by removing those dams, you're just kind of you're updating and you're using your natural resources more efficiently. And so I hope that as we enter into this next era, we're at a place where people don't see the assertion of Indian rights as a threat. Instead, they see them as a really powerful tool to create the changes we need in how we manage natural resources and how we use natural resources to make them more sustainable. So I would hope that we would never even get on the list.
Yeah.
But that kind of leads me to the second point. If for whatever reason, an Indian organization found themselves on the list and their 501c3 status threatened, there could be strategies for that organization to continue to do the work. One of the things I was thinking about is, now there are a lot of Indian-based nonprofits, and I know that we as a community are very strong, and we are going to get through the next 4 years, whether it's, an IRS attack or whatever it might be. We are going to get through these attacks by supporting one another and organizing locally and making stronger partnerships with our allies, because we are strong, right? And we will continue to be stronger and grow stronger over this next 4 years.
That's some good advice. I'm actually really glad that I asked you that, because I know there's probably people watching that they're involved with the nonprofit, and they probably aren't even aware of this bill coming down.
Yeah.
And so being able to get that insight, especially from a lawyer, is important.
Well, and I think too, one, it's only passed the House, so hopefully it won't pass the Senate. But then 3, philanthropy has a huge role in all this, right? Like it's time now where we need philanthropic organizations to really step up and support us in greater ways, so that we have that, financial stability to know that we can provide for our people and keep our missions, strong through this time.
Well, we're coming up at the end of the interview, but I really appreciate you.
Oh,
and I know everyone else here listening, they appreciate you. Thank you. Our ancestors, you're the face of your ancestors, just like I'm the face of my ancestors. Right. And you definitely made your ancestors proud, and you continue to every day. Do you have anything, closing statements, or any advice or guidance you'd like to offer any natives out there?
Oh, that's wonderful. Whatever it is, you can do it, and just keep working hard, and pray to the Creator and your ancestors for that strength. Go to your traditional homelands, to your waters and your lands, and ask for the strength, and live in a good way, treat others well, and things will work out. So
thank you.
Yeah. And thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to be a part of your podcast, and congratulations to you too, and all the great work that you're doing.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right.
So, thank you.
Thank you for watching.
Thanks.